The wind over Tokyo Bay carried a silence the city had never known. Burnt timbers still smoked where neighborhoods had once stood, and in the morning haze, the ruins looked like shadows of a vanished world. On the docks, a young American private shifted uncomfortably beside a line of exhausted Japanese officers. Their uniforms hung loose, the last fabric of an empire that no longer existed. Before we begin, if you love uncovering forgotten World War II stories, take a second to subscribe. It keeps history alive. One officer, his hands trembling, tried to straighten his torn collar as an American soldier approached. In his arms was not a weapon, but a bundle of neatly folded clothes. The officer froze. For months he had expected humiliation, punishment, perhaps execution. Instead, the soldier held out the bundle with quiet eyes. For a long moment, the two men just stood there, one unable to understand, the other unsure how to explain mercy. Then, with shaking hands, the officer reached out. Something broke inside him. Only weeks earlier, these same hands had gripped a sword in service to the Emperor. Now they clutched a simple shirt, a gift from the enemy. The uniform that once defined his honor was gone, and in its place came something he had never known: kindness. The war was over, but the war within had just begun. When Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed across Japan on August 15, 1945, the entire nation seemed to stop breathing. Never before had the Japanese people heard their divine ruler speak. His voice, thin and distant through the radio, carried one unbearable message: surrender. Endure the unendurable, he said. For the men of the Imperial Army, it was more than defeat. It was the death of everything they had been taught to believe. Across the islands, soldiers who had fought with fanatical devotion sat in stunned silence. Some tore off their insignias, unwilling to bear the shame. Others wept, kneeling in disbelief. In places like Saipan and Okinawa, the thousands had chosen suicide over surrender. To live was dishonor, and now that dishonor had become the fate of the entire nation. In the jungles of the Philippines and the mountains of China, pockets of Japanese troops continued to fight, unaware or unwilling to believe that the war was finished. Communications had collapsed. The code of Bushido, loyalty, courage, self-sacrifice, had been their compass. Now even that compass pointed to nothing. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ended more than a war. It had ended an idea. Japan's proud cities lay in ruins. Over 2 million civilians were homeless. Starvation loomed, and disease crept through the ashes of what had been an empire. For those who had worn the emperor's uniform, the loss was total. They were stripped not just of weapons and power, but of identity. In makeshift camps across Japan, disarmed officers sat beside their former enemies. Their swords had been confiscated, their flags burned. The imperial rescript on surrender demanded obedience to the Allies, yet many could barely comprehend what that meant. To obey a foreign commander, to live under occupation, was unthinkable. Yet here they were, gaunt, silent, and cold. The first American units entered Tokyo cautiously. The Japanese government had warned that resistance might continue. But what they found was not defiance. It was emptiness. Streets once filled with marching troops now echoed with the shuffle of barefoot survivors. Children scavenged among ruins for food. Entire families lived beneath collapsed roofs. Among the occupying soldiers, some expected hostility. They had been trained to see the Japanese as fanatics, cruel and inhuman. But what they saw instead were people broken by hunger and loss. The image of the enemy began to blur. On one October morning, in the courtyard of a former military academy, a group of Japanese officers waited for inspection. They had been ordered to surrender their remaining gear: boots, belts, coats. Standing in the cold autumn air, they looked less like warriors and more like ghosts. The American officer in charge hesitated. He had seen prisoners of war before, but never men so stripped of hope. Quietly, he sent a private back to the truck and returned with bundles of clothing, surplus American uniforms. The reaction was unlike anything he expected. Some officers refused at first, bowing their heads in shame. Others took the clothes with shaking hands, tears falling silently. These were men raised to believe that mercy was weakness, that the enemy's compassion was deceit. Yet in that instant, something shifted. For the Americans, the gesture was simple, a matter of decency. But for the Japanese, it carried unbearable weight. To be clothed by the enemy was to accept a new world, one where survival replaced pride and humanity replaced ritual. It was not the destruction of Hiroshima or the firebombing of Tokyo that broke them. It was this, a quiet act of kindness that shattered the armor of a defeated soul. In the weeks following surrender, Japan existed in a kind of suspended grief. Food was rationed, the black market thrived. Former soldiers sold family heirlooms for rice. Mothers bartered silk kimonos for bread. And through it all, American soldiers walked the streets, distributing supplies, guarding warehouses, and sometimes, when no one was watching, sharing what little they had. Every gesture blurred the old boundaries of war. The same men who had once fought to the death now shared cigarettes, traded stories through interpreters, or simply stood in silence beside each other. The occupation was unlike anything the world had seen before. Not a conquest, but a transformation. The Americans came expecting resistance. What they found was surrender so profound, it felt like mourning. The Japanese had not just lost a war, they had lost their universe. The emperor was no longer divine. The army was no longer sacred. Even the word Japan seemed uncertain. And yet, from that uncertainty, a strange kind of peace began to grow, one built not on fear, but on unexpected compassion. It was only the beginning of a relationship that would redefine both nations. But in those first months, every small act, a shared meal, a word of respect, a piece of clothing, carried the weight of history. The soldiers who accepted those gifts would never forget the moment. For them, it was not charity. It was resurrection. General Douglas MacArthur stepped onto Japanese soil on August 30th, 1945. The photograph of that moment, the tall, pipe-smoking general descending from his transport plane at Atsugi Airfield, would become one of the defining images of the century. Behind him stood officers of the American occupation, their boots sinking slightly into the dust. In front of them, rows of defeated Japanese soldiers stood motionless, their faces empty, their uniforms ragged. The supreme commander of the Allied powers had arrived not as a conqueror in the old sense, but as an architect of reconstruction. Yet few that day could grasp what kind of future he intended to build. To the Japanese, MacArthur was a living symbol of humiliation, the embodiment of the power that had destroyed their empire. But to many Americans, he represented something more ambitious, the chance to prove that mercy could succeed where vengeance never could. Tokyo was a shell of its former self. The great imperial city that had once boasted the pride of a rising empire now lay flattened. Bridges twisted like bones, train lines lay broken, and from the government quarter rose a haze of dust and wood smoke. Civilians moved through the ruins in slow silence, carrying bundles of what little remained of their possessions. The smell of burnt rice and ash hung over everything. Food shortages reached catastrophic levels. By the autumn of 1945, millions faced starvation. Rice, Japan's sacred staple, had become a rare luxury. Children waited in endless lines for bowls of watery soup provided by occupation kitchens. Diseases like dysentery and tuberculosis spread through refugee camps. In the countryside, farmers buried their harvests, fearful of losing it to scavengers or soldiers. Among the worst hit were the former military officers. Their pay had vanished with the collapse of the government. Many were discharged without pensions or rations. The same men who had once commanded divisions now wandered through markets selling watches, medals, or even swords to survive. In the eyes of the public, they were not heroes. They were reminders of a tragedy no one wished to recall. For the Americans, the challenge was monumental. How could they rebuild a nation that had been taught for generations to see them as monsters? MacArthur's strategy was revolutionary for its time. Instead of crushing Japan under punitive occupation, he sought to transform it through reform, politically, economically, and psychologically. He began by dismantling the military establishment. Over 7 million soldiers were disarmed and demobilized. Weapons were melted down. Military academies were shut. Even martial songs were banned from public performance. The Imperial cult, the belief that the Emperor was a living god, was stripped away in a declaration broadcast in January 1946. For the Japanese people, it was as if heaven itself had fallen silent. The American soldiers stationed across Japan were under strict orders: treat civilians with dignity. Looting, violence, and revenge were forbidden. Each soldier carried with him not just a rifle, but a moral burden to embody the very principles his nation claimed to defend. Still, mistrust lingered. Many Japanese expected cruelty. Stories of atrocities in China and the Pacific had fueled terror of what occupation might bring. Mothers hid their daughters. Fathers refused to speak in English when soldiers passed. Yet, day by day, the Americans defied those fears. They handed out food, they reopened hospitals, they repaired bridges and railways. At first, these acts were met with suspicion. Some believed the generosity was propaganda, but hunger softened pride. And slowly, gratitude began to replace fear. In letters, diaries, and later memoirs, many Japanese civilians wrote of their astonishment at how disciplined and humane the occupation forces were. In cities like Yokohama, American soldiers built orphanages for children whose parents had been killed in bombings. They distributed chocolate, canned milk, and, most poignantly, clothing. To people who had lived through years of scarcity, even a worn jacket carried the weight of salvation. But for the former officers, that gesture cut deeper than any wound from battle. Their entire lives had been defined by uniforms, symbols of loyalty and rank. To remove one's uniform after surrender was to step outside of the only identity they had ever known. When Americans offered civilian clothes, it was both an act of kindness and an existential blow. One captain later recalled standing in line to receive donated garments from an American supply unit. When his turn came, he was handed a bundle of used shirts and trousers. They smelled of soap, he wrote years later, not of sweat, not of war, of soap. He could not hold them, his body trembled, and he began to cry. That moment, repeated countless times across occupied Japan, marked a turning point deeper than any political reform. The officer's tears were not just for the defeat of his nation, but for the collapse of the world that had shaped him. The enemy he had been taught to hate was now the hand that kept him from freezing. For the Americans, this compassion was strategic as well as moral. Washington understood that revenge would only plant the seeds of future conflict. Reconstruction, by contrast, could forge an ally. The Marshall Plan would soon demonstrate this philosophy in Europe, but Japan was the first test, and the symbol of that new doctrine was not a flag or a speech. It was a simple act of giving clothes to the conquered. The streets of Tokyo began to fill again with life. Markets reopened, streetcars rattled along patched rails. On every corner, American posters urged democracy, education, and cooperation. Schools rewrote textbooks. Newspapers were censored not for nationalism, but for despair. The old Imperial slogans, "Glory for 10,000 years," were replaced by new ones, "Peace through work." And through all of it, the relationship between occupier and occupied grew more complex. The Japanese admired the Americans' efficiency and order. The Americans, in turn, were surprised by the discipline, humility, and resilience of the people they had defeated. In mess halls and supply depots, small exchanges continued, a soldier handing out a coat, a child offering a paper crane in return. They were gestures so small they might have seemed trivial, but history would remember them as the first stitches in a torn fabric of humanity. The Japanese officers who once stood on battlefields now queued silently for food and clothing. Yet beneath the surface of shame, a new kind of resolve began to stir, not the will to conquer, but to rebuild. The same precision and dedication that had once fueled Japan's war machine would soon drive its recovery. The moment when mercy replaced hatred did not make headlines, but it lived quietly in the hearts of those who experienced it. For the men who had once carried swords and shouted battle cries for the Emperor, compassion from the enemy was a wound more painful than bullets. The American soldier's kindness struck deeper than defeat itself. It stripped away the wall between conqueror and conquered. And in that moment, Japan began to rediscover what it meant to be human. To understand this transformation, we must look at the war's aftermath through its many angles: the human, the tactical, the psychological, the leadership, and the cultural. Each reveals a fragment of how one act of mercy reshaped a nation's soul. The human angle began in the ruins, among the hungry, the barefoot, the ashamed. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric giants, men who tortured prisoners and desecrated honor. But when those same monsters handed out bread and clothes, the illusion shattered. Mothers wept as soldiers offered rations to their children. Farmers bowed deeply when trucks arrived bringing medicine. Some civilians could not bring themselves to accept food, whispering, "We are unworthy." The U.S. soldiers, many barely 20 years old, struggled to comprehend what they saw. They had fought brutal battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, losing friends to suicidal attacks, bayonets, and kamikaze raids. Yet here they stood among the same people, not as destroyers, but as guardians. Compassion felt strange, almost defiant, a rebellion against hatred. One Marine wrote home, "I gave a coat to a man who probably would have killed me a year ago. He bowed so low I thought he would break. I didn't feel like a victor. I just felt human again." That was the paradox of peace. It demanded more courage than war ever had. On the tactical front, the occupation was an experiment unlike any in history. The Allies could have dismantled Japan completely, leaving it to chaos. Instead, the U.S. adopted a strategy that blended firmness with humanity. The goal was not punishment. It was transformation. The policy became known as the reverse course, emphasizing economic recovery and democratic reform rather than endless penance. MacArthur understood that Japan's loyalty could be won, not forced. By preserving the emperor as a symbolic figurehead, he avoided civil collapse. By feeding the hungry, he turned potential enemies into allies. Even the distribution of clothing carried tactical purpose. Dressed, fed, and employed civilians were less likely to revolt. Mercy became the most effective weapon in America's post-war arsenal. Psychologically, the impact was profound. For centuries, Japan's warrior class had been governed by Bushido, a code of honor that placed loyalty and death above defeat. To surrender was to abandon dignity. When American soldiers extended compassion, it shattered that moral geometry. Acts of mercy confused men trained to measure worth by endurance and sacrifice. For many officers, accepting help meant confronting the collapse of their identity. They were no longer warriors, protectors, or patriots, just men. Naked, cold, hungry men. When the enemy covered their bodies with clothes, it felt as though their shame was being witnessed. Some wept openly. Others turned away, muttering prayers to ancestors who would never understand. Yet in that humiliation lay rebirth. The code that once demanded death now made room for life. The leadership angle tells another story. Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech, the Jewel Voice broadcast, had already begun the process of humanizing Japan's institutions. His later appearance with General MacArthur, standing side by side for the cameras, sent a message no army could ignore. The war was not only over, the era of divine rulers was over too. The emperor's calm acceptance of defeat modeled a new kind of strength, one rooted in humility rather than dominance. American leadership, too, evolved in response. Officers overseeing the occupation were instructed not to gloat, not to insult, and not to provoke resentment. They were reminded that every soldier's action would define America's moral authority. It was a victory of restraint, a rare moment when power chose decency over revenge. But perhaps the deepest transformation occurred within the enemy's perception itself, what we might call the moral angle. When Japanese citizens saw Americans treating them as equals, something ancient began to crumble. The myth of racial superiority, the ideology of sacred war, the hatred that justified cruelty, all of it eroded in the face of compassion. Children who once practiced stabbing dummies labeled enemy in schoolyards were now learning English from those same enemies. In the alleys of Tokyo, friendships formed where blood had once flowed. Small cafes began serving GI's rice and fish. Jazz music, banned during the war, echoed softly from radios. The rhythms of life slowly replaced the drums of war. And through it all, the memory of that first offering, a coat, a shirt, a loaf of bread, lingered as the symbol of a new beginning. There were, of course, moments of misunderstanding and resentment. Not every American behaved nobly. Not every Japanese citizen accepted mercy with grace. But the overwhelming current of history flowed toward reconciliation, not revenge. By 1947, the sight of Japanese workers wearing American surplus jackets had become common. Some still bore the names of their previous owners stitched inside: Johnson, Miller, Smith. The fabric of the enemy became the fabric of survival. Men who had once worn medals now wore foreign names over their hearts. For a generation raised to die for the emperor, living under the mercy of the enemy was both unbearable and miraculous. Their tears were not weakness. They were recognition that humanity had survived what war tried to erase. The next layer of this story unfolds at the very heart of that transformation, in the moment when shame met mercy face to face, and the spirit of a nation broke, only to rise again. Among the ruins of post-war Japan, leadership took on a new and fragile shape. The generals who had once commanded divisions now swept the floors of police stations. The bureaucrats who had signed decrees for conquest now rewrote them for reconstruction. And at the center of it all stood Emperor Hirohito, no longer divine, but still the quiet axis of a broken people. His image, once untouchable, was now strangely human. When he appeared in public wearing a simple suit instead of imperial robes, citizens stared in disbelief. Here was the man for whom they had fought, the man in whose name they had died. Reduced to flesh and humility, the Americans had insisted on it. MacArthur understood the psychological power of preserving the emperor, not as a god, but as a symbol of continuity. The people could not rebuild if their faith collapsed completely. So Hirohito became something new, a bridge between the old Japan that had perished and the new one struggling to live. American officers noted the transformation. They had prepared for hostility but found something else: order. Even in ruin, Japan obeyed. Factories began to reopen under Allied supervision. Women entered workplaces once closed to them. The Constitution, rewritten under MacArthur's guidance, abolished war as a national right. It was a revolution without blood. Yet beneath that order, emotions ran deep and raw. In camps for demobilized officers, silence hung heavy. Some men could not meet each other's eyes. They avoided mirrors. They avoided questions. What had it all been for? What did loyalty mean now that the emperor himself had surrendered? For men raised to die in service, survival felt like betrayal. The Americans tried to ease their suffering with practicality: food, medicine, clothing. They did not realize that each act of kindness carried a moral weight the Japanese officers could barely bear. To be fed by the enemy was one humiliation. To be clothed by him was another entirely. When American quartermasters distributed surplus uniforms in late 1945 and early 1946, many Japanese soldiers stood motionless, refusing to move forward in line. Translators explained, pleaded. Some finally stepped up, bowing deeply before accepting the garments. Others took them without a word, their faces expressionless, their hands trembling. There are records, brief notes from occupation diaries, describing how some officers wept when they put on those clothes. They cried not out of gratitude alone, but out of recognition. The stiff cotton and foreign stitching carried a message they had never been taught. Compassion could exist even between enemies. For a culture forged in centuries of hierarchy and sacrifice, that realization was almost unbearable. And yet, it also planted the seed of rebirth. In the following months, thousands of former soldiers found work in reconstruction projects managed by the Americans. They labored to rebuild railways, ports, and power plants. Each task, laying bricks, hauling timber, repairing bridges, became an unspoken atonement. The hands that once held rifles now rebuilt what war had destroyed. On the American side, compassion deepened into respect. Soldiers who had fought on Pacific islands began to see the Japanese not as enemies, but as reflections of themselves. Young men caught in ideologies far larger than they could control. Letters home spoke of admiration for Japan's discipline, cleanliness, and resolve. "They bow to us," one corporal wrote, "but there's a dignity in it. They bow because they choose to live." The enemy angle of this story was perhaps the most revealing. American soldiers had seen horrors in places like Tarawa and Okinawa that had erased pity from their hearts. But standing amid Tokyo's ashes, they discovered something different. That victory carried its own form of sorrow. Some confessed they no longer felt triumph. They felt responsibility. In interviews years later, veterans recalled moments that stayed with them more vividly than combat. One told of giving his coat to a shivering Japanese officer and realizing, for the first time, that he wanted the man to live. "I thought I hated them," he said, "but when I saw him shake from the cold, I couldn't walk away. Maybe we were both just tired of hate." The cultural angle reveals how deeply this compassion altered the Japanese psyche. Clothing, in their tradition, had always carried symbolism: the robe of a samurai, the uniform of a soldier, the kimono of a bride. It represented identity, role, and belonging. To wear the enemy's clothing was to cross into forbidden territory. Yet that act, forced by survival, became a quiet ritual of transformation. In old photographs from 1946, you can see them. Japanese men in oversized American jackets, trousers rolled at the ankles, caps tilted awkwardly. They look neither defeated nor victorious, simply human. The cloth that once marked the divide between conqueror and conquered now blurred it. Each thread stitched the first fragile bonds of understanding. In small ways, the gift of clothing reshaped behavior. Former officers began helping distribute supplies to civilians. They volunteered at relief stations run by Americans. They taught discipline and order to maintain peace in their districts. Pride returned, not in conquest, but in cooperation. MacArthur's headquarters recognized this psychological shift as vital. Reports to Washington described a population exceedingly cooperative, dignified in hardship, and responsive to fair treatment. In the quiet exchange of clothes, the Americans had done something no amount of propaganda could achieve. They had humanized victory. From those humble beginnings, an alliance began to form. The uniforms that once symbolized submission would soon give way to suits and work clothes, the attire of engineers, factory workers, and teachers who would rebuild Japan's future. But before that rebirth came the moment of reckoning, the instant when shame and mercy met, and a nation's heart broke open beneath the weight of compassion. The winter of 1946 was bitter across Japan. The Allied occupation had brought stability but not warmth. Cities still lay in ruins, and fuel was scarce. In Tokyo, families burned scraps of wood and paper to keep from freezing. Among them were thousands of former soldiers, men stripped of rank, identity, and purpose. Their uniforms, worn thin and torn from years of war, were the last symbols of who they once were. It was in this season that one of the most haunting scenes of the occupation unfolded. At a repatriation camp outside Yokosuka, where officers returning from China and Southeast Asia were processed, American soldiers organized a distribution of supplies. There were boxes of rations, blankets, and piles of folded clothes. American surplus, practical and plain. The Japanese officers stood in lines that stretched across the courtyard, their faces stiff in the cold wind. They had endured the unendurable. Some had not eaten properly in days. Many had watched comrades die from starvation or disease in prison camps. Yet none of it compared to the shame of this moment. To receive clothing from the enemy was, in their eyes, the final surrender. An American lieutenant, barely 25, stepped onto a makeshift platform. Through an interpreter, he explained that each man would receive food, soap, and clothing. "You have fought bravely," he said. "Now we help you live." The interpreter hesitated before translating those words. Even he knew how they would sound. When the distribution began, silence blanketed the camp. The Americans handed out garments one by one, jackets, shirts, boots, while the Japanese received them with mechanical bows. Then near the front of the line, an older officer stepped forward. His face was hollow, his uniform held together by string. When the soldier reached out with a folded coat, the officer froze. His hands trembled, but he did not take it. The crowd behind him watched, motionless. The moment stretched. The lieutenant, unsure what to do, nodded gently. "It's all right," he said quietly. The interpreter repeated it. Still the officer did not move. Then slowly, he lowered his head and accepted the coat. He pressed it to his chest like a sacred object. A sound escaped him, a choked sob that seemed to carry years of buried emotion. The man behind him began to cry, too. Others turned away, trying to hide their tears. Dozens of proud, broken soldiers wept openly as they clutched the clothes of their conquerors. The Americans stood in stunned silence. They had seen enemies fall in battle, but never like this, not from bullets, but from mercy. It was not humiliation they felt. It was release, the heavy armor of ideology, of obedience, of divine war. All of it cracked in that instant. The enemy's kindness had done what defeat could not. It pierced the heart. One Japanese colonel interviewed years later recalled that day with quiet reverence. "When the American gave me that coat," he said, "I realized he did not see me as a beast or a demon. He saw me as a man. That was when I began to live again." For the Americans, the sight was unforgettable. Letters sent home spoke not of victory, but of sorrow and respect. "We thought we'd see hatred," one sergeant wrote, "but what we saw was grief. Grief so deep, it could only be met with silence." In many ways, that moment marked the spiritual end of the war. Not the signing on the USS Missouri, not the mushroom clouds, but the simple gesture of one man offering another a coat. It was the moment when domination turned into responsibility and vengeance gave way to understanding. American officers documented the event in occupation reports, noting the emotional response of the Japanese prisoners. Some analysts tried to explain it in terms of culture and honor, but the truth was simpler. Compassion had shattered the machinery of hate. Across Japan, similar moments echoed. In Nagasaki, American medics tended to wounded civilians still suffering from radiation sickness. In Osaka, soldiers shared rations with orphans. In Yokohama, naval engineers rebuilt water lines so families could wash again. Each act, small as it seemed, added another thread to the fragile bridge between two worlds. For the Japanese, it was bewildering. They had been told that Americans would enslave their people, desecrate their temples, and destroy their culture. Yet here were those same Americans rebuilding homes, feeding children, and, most shockingly, offering respect. The officers who had broken down in that camp became silent witnesses to Japan's rebirth. Many later joined reconstruction efforts, channeling their discipline into rebuilding the industries they once used for war. They carried within them a new understanding that true strength lies not in domination, but in dignity. In Buddhist temples across the country, priests began to speak of a great cleansing, a purging of arrogance through suffering. To the faithful, the act of being clothed by the enemy became a symbol of rebirth, like shedding old skin. In art and literature, the motif of the coat or the garment appeared repeatedly in post-war works. Writers described it as the second uniform, not of war, but of peace. It represented the rediscovery of humanity after years of darkness. Even MacArthur, in his private correspondence, noted the moral transformation he witnessed. "The Japanese are learning democracy not from our speeches," he wrote, "but from our behavior." By 1947, the American coat had become a quiet symbol of reconciliation. Photographs show Japanese men wearing U.S. Army jackets while clearing rubble, while teaching in newly reopened schools, while planting seeds in fields once scarred by bomb craters. The fabric of the enemy had become the fabric of survival and of peace. No ceremony marked this change, no anthem played. But in that unrecorded moment of tears and silence, something vast shifted in the human story of war. The conqueror learned mercy, and the conquered learned forgiveness. And from that fragile meeting of opposites, a new alliance would rise, one that would transform the world in ways neither could yet imagine. When the first spring after surrender came, Japan still looked like a graveyard. Cities were gray and silent, the air heavy with smoke and hunger. Yet beneath the wreckage, something invisible had begun to stir. The act of mercy, the gift of clothing, food, and dignity, had done more than heal bodies. It had changed hearts. The Americans continued their mission of rebuilding. Schools reopened, bridges were repaired, and the factories that once built weapons now made sewing machines and bicycles. Former officers became teachers, engineers, and clerks. Many still wore the same American jackets they had been given in the camps, the fabric patched but preserved. A quiet reminder of the moment when their hatred broke. MacArthur's policies began to take root. A new constitution banned war and gave women the right to vote. Land reforms ended centuries of feudal hierarchy. The Americans called it democratization, but for ordinary Japanese it felt like rebirth, a chance to start again without fear or pride. In homes across Tokyo, people whispered about the Americans differently now. They were still foreigners, still conquerors, but no longer monsters. Some even smiled when soldiers passed. Children waved. A few words of English began to appear on shop signs. Jazz and swing records filled the night air. And among the American troops, the respect was mutual. Soldiers wrote home that Japan had surprised them, not with defiance, but with discipline, kindness, and humility. They saw men who had lost everything, still bowing in gratitude for a meal, still sweeping the streets, still rebuilding from nothing. It was a lesson in dignity the victors had not expected to learn. By 1948, Japan's recovery was visible. The markets bustled again. Newspapers printed stories of industry returning. The scars of war remained, but they were no longer open wounds. The country that had once sought dominance now sought excellence in craftsmanship, education, and cooperation. The emotional distance between the two nations shrank each year. Former enemies became partners. In factories funded by American aid, Japanese workers stitched together fabrics that would soon be exported to the world. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The same hands that once received American clothes were now making their own. For the men who had wept in the repatriation camps, that transformation carried a quiet pride. They never forgot the day when mercy came dressed as an American uniform. Many kept the garments for years, folded neatly in drawers, never worn again, a sacred relic of the day they learned the enemy could be kind. In that humility, Japan found strength. The shame of defeat turned into the determination to rise, not through war, but through work. And in the eyes of those who had offered the first coat, there was a deeper understanding. True victory is not won on battlefields. It's won in the hearts that choose compassion over revenge. In the end, it wasn't the bombs or the treaties that changed Japan. It was a quiet moment, an American hand offering a coat to a trembling man who had lost everything. That gesture, simple and human, carried more power than any weapon. It told a defeated nation that mercy could exist even after horror. It reminded the victors that strength without compassion is hollow. From that silence between enemies, a friendship was born, one that would turn former foes into allies and ashes into ambition. And somewhere in that memory, folded in the fabric of an old American jacket, lives the proof that sometimes the smallest kindness can end the greatest war.